still in the desert on the feast of John the Baptist. So I'll just return for a second to where I left off with regard to it's the Epistle of St. James here. It's chapter 1. So he's asking that we be quick to listen and slow to speak, and then slow to human anger. God's saving justice is never served by human anger. This self-control is a part of human maturity as much as anything else. People have ways and means of controlling each other without anger, but there are means of controlling nevertheless. Women have particular means of controlling, often linked with moods, and for the sake of peace, a man will yield and anticipate. But dialogue is the signal of true relationship and communion of soul. The epistle goes on, do away with all impurities and remnants of evil, humbly welcome the word which has been planted in you and can save your souls. Humbly welcome the word. The humble soul is a quiet soul, a gentle soul, an empty soul. And this approach to life is something that perhaps we can take with us, a certain gentleness of approach. In the monastic life, gentleness characterizes the whole ethos, a certain courtesy, a certain absence of rudesse, the monastic discipline of not using just the first name, but that element of respect comes into it. It's brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so, or father so-and-so, and that element of dignity in relationship. But it is something that, as consecrated beings, should mark our character. We respect also even things. The attitude of a person towards what he has received. A person who is losing control will start to make noises. Of course, it goes to extremes when he bangs a door. But in general, why go through life in noisy mood? People who, for instance, just cannot bear the sound of silence. And people right now in the Western world are contaminated to the extent that they cannot actually bear solitude. If they are alone, what will they do? They'll start to look up the last message on the mobile phone. In other words, straight away their soul is engaged with other souls. If one watches somebody now in the street, look carefully and you'll see that as often as not, they'll have something in their ear. Even when they're doing something which is a natural act, they are listening to some, and it wouldn't be usually music, but it would be noise. Let's be blunt, it would be thumping noises, which is again going to take away from their gentleness of character and soul, because there's thumping going on inside them. The modern music is not healing at all to the soul. It's rather sad. People are exposed to unpacifying messages. And then, when they're at home, it's not just one source of other words that they will have immediately, but in their mobile phones they'll have many, many, many channels of communication. And it's all what? It's outside their soul, draining their soul, and also taking away from its capacity to hear. That's what's out there. Souls are contaminated by words. Now, we are caught up in this sphere as well if we're not careful. Because usually now we are fairly good at these modern means of communication. Now, they are great blessings when well used. But the secret is using them well. Now, the specific element of solitude, which also we need if we are to be free at times, we have to be careful to know how to have it. Now, we do not have to be available all the time to everyone. I have found in the specific life that I am living that to fulfill the demands of that life, which is actually in canon law 603, where you are asked to be separated from people, it's there, it's physically there, that has to be done concretely in several different sectors, which immediately would not occur to one. The timetable is one. Now, one has to translate to one's own situation, but there are times when one has to be just not accessible. The night a point comes when that is not anyone else's. In the monastic life, it's very early. If one gets up in the night, as tradition has it, if it has to be very early. There's no answering anything after whatever it might be. But then, the choice, not only at night, but in the day, is the mobile phone going to be on or not? And if, in what degree? I would say that it is better, if possible, when getting into the mode of existence as a priest, of not being in a situation where a person in front of us is going to be interrupted by someone else in one's pocket immediately demanding attention, and then, if we're not careful, we're extremely rude to the person who actually is before us, preferring the absent person who can't see what's going on to that person there. And it happens more than we think. And we're expected, when lay people are there, and they do that actually sometimes, they answer the phone. And you have to wait until they're finished. But we must give the example of courtesy, that these have to be mastered, these gadgets. But having said that, there is more. Because that can be done through silent mode, just silent mode, having it on. But the other question is, should it be always on at all? I mean, always. Because one can, it depends on one's responsibility and need to be available. But there are ways and means, e.g. having a second phone. You see what I mean? A hot line. Mm-hmm. That's one way. It works very well, actually, as long as we're very careful about the second number. It works. It's the means I have with my parish priest. He and one or two other people can get me straight away if there's an urgency, e.g. somebody dying. He can get me. Therefore, there is availability, but it's not immediate. But the other one, that's what I found, it's the only way that if one can educate people, that one will open the phone once or twice a day. In a monastic way, it's a way of getting around it, and we'll find together, accumulating, when one opens it, maybe 6 messages. But you see the difference. It's a huge difference with regard to freedom in the day. Now, everyone has to adapt to a situation, but the situation where a priest is automatically presumed to be available at any time, that is questionable. I mean, on that level. Because one's quality of life will go down. One will perpetually be just like that, bombarded and taken away from profundity of thought and engagement with something which needs time. So one has to know, therefore, how to navigate within the new society in which we're living. Now, there are others, and of course the big ones. I have at home the landline, the fixed phone, normally I have it always off. Always, that's the way I do it at home. And then a message will come on the answer machine eventually if you're away. But at least there's freedom, there's silence in the house. Now, but in many parishes there will be a secretary, obviously that's different. At least there's a barrage, there's some kind of barricade, somebody else will answer, whatever. But the other one I want to attack is important because we're all involved in it. It's the world of cybersphere. The whole element of new modes of being in contact with individuals and with the whole planet. It has to be mastered. Now, the extremely precious these new means, for instance, it costs nothing practically to send out messages to a large number in a short time compared with the post. Texts also can be good ways of getting a message through to a certain number even, just like that. And of not having to spend time in a conversation. Because that's a useful thing. A text does not need to take time. But we need to look carefully at what is going to contaminate our desert with regard to our being on the agora of the cybersphere. Now, I had seen in my monastery how actually through the novitiate things had changed. I was an novice pastor, so I was watching all this happening. Novices were never to have a mobile phone, and of course, this question of anything else came in eventually through those coming into the monastery, the novices, who had all this that we didn't have, because they weren't coming from the world. And it was a novice who got us all together and explained exactly what internet was about and how it worked and so on. So we listened very carefully. And then eventually we chose we would have internet. But we would never have internet in cell, in the individual cell. That was in the initial way. It would be the scriptorium, where there would be a computer there for everyone, and different computers actually. But twice a day, I think, maybe once, it would be opened and sent as regards sending and receiving all the messages in one go. That was the first barrage, of course. Time went on, in they came to the individual cells. What's there? Then you've got each monk in his cell. What have you got in practice? He would have, as time went on, a mobile. You'd have on that coming in texts. You'd have that coming in individual calls. You'd have in your cell the intercom with the other brethren and with the front door, which would then, of course, invite for confessions, because that's how they get us. Okay, that's healthy. Then you'd have this other new batch of things, as well as direct from the outside, the ordinary landline, which is we bought lots of phone calls coming there. You'd have, according to one's readiness to get involved, all the time, the itch to know what the latest email, that was the big one, was coming in. Now, do you see what happens there? An email is something that solicits immediately an answer. And the person at the end knows it and wants it. He's there wanting an immediate answer. So one tends to give an immediate answer and off it goes. What happens? Immediately there's an answer to an answer. Now multiply that by 10 and what you have? You're there, they're coming in. Do you see what's happening? This is quality time in your cell, the monastic cell, the desert we're at today. Now, it doesn't stop there. If you start then with young monks forming a website and so on, what happens? The whole world that you do not know, from Australia to America, English language, will come to you with all kinds of unsolicited emails. What's happening there? This time, where you've come away from the world for your desert to be with your God in your sanctum, which is the desert cell, which was inaccessible to anyone in the generations gone by, Suddenly you've got therein the whole world. And time has been destroyed. The whole object of your coming to the desert has been overturned. Now, it can be handled, but with only a huge amount of human maturity. Maturity in knowing how and who is in command of what. Who is in control. It can be done, but we have to see the danger. Because our priestly life needs that gentleness of mode where we're not aggressed, like always being switched on to some message. We need a virgin solitude and separation to some extent from the non-sacred and the non-divine. Our soul is shielded by the body. Now, if our body is plugged in, either through the ears or through the eyes engaged with the cybersphere, our soul has very little separation from the outside. Our soul is almost plugged in to all that can be coming from the cybersphere and the waves of the air. What is in the cybersphere? Well, do you know that statistically the most visited sites out there in the cybersphere are pornographic ones? Now, therefore, it's neutral in itself, but there's a preponderation of contamination. Television, it's going quickly in the same direction if we're not careful, because all the time the barriers are coming down. Now, every time we engage with all this world, virtual world, we're close to the emitters of all that, sinister ones, quite often, soliciting our attention in the margins. Just we're one click away from impurity of which this speaks. And once it's there, it's lodged. We are more at risk than others because we're not used to that. So we're responsible for what comes in. So maturity on every level. And I would say a good instinct every time one opens that virtual realm of the cybersphere, it's a realm, is to have the invocation, just an invocation of the Holy Spirit, just to lead therein in the time that we're engaged with the whole world. Now, I want to zoom into just one thing today, shortly. It's the fact that we need to be aware that our enemy is a reality and is interested in us. That the satanic forces are interested in priests. And if one notices which priests fall, one notices that they're very often priests who start off very well. They are particularly a nuisance to the satanic forces and therefore a centre of interest to them. I was reading an exorcism of some soul, and it turned out that there was a lost priest involved, and this soul of the lost priest was amongst those that were possessing this person. And under exorcism, the demons and this human demon in their midst were obliged to answer certain truths, often against their wish, because Christ is present in the person of the exorcist with his supreme authority, because Satan is also a creature and has to obey when eventually it comes to the trunch. And so was being pulled out, for our knowledge, it was allowed by God, certain truths about why this priest had lost his soul. And it is interesting that it started well. He died, this is going back quite a few, it was going back, I think, to about the 1700s perhaps. He did exist, they found out all the evidence, and it's a true person, and he was in France. Anyway, a few things come through which are of use to us. Initially, he was aware that he was falling, but he was coming back, and he was aware that he was displeasing, but he was coming back. Then by bit, what was happening was this. He was getting used to sin, and sin was having an effect on his taste for the divine. It was becoming boring for him. The sacred mysteries he would go through quickly and with a certain lack of relish and taste. It was boring now because that relationship had gone. Now, the point at which apparently the Lord was no longer able to get through was when, from initially with the breviary saying, well, I'll maybe shorten this bit, maybe I'll get this bit back later on, postponing, it became, I can't be bothered. And he started to omit things and not do it properly. And then what happened was this, apparently, at that point, when he was not coming back to the breviary, there was no point at which the Lord could get through to him. He'd crowded out the impulses of grace by doing things all the time.